Agriculture for Smallholders and Agribusiness Programme funded by UK Aid. CASA seeks to change how investors, donors and governments view and invest in agribusinesses that work with smallholder supply chains. You can find out more at casaprogram.com. Today is the first in the series of 4 platforms, and today we will discuss the practical impacts of the crisis for value chains and systems. In the following weeks, we will consider how agribusinesses and investors are adapting to survive. How do we manage the environmental and public health aspects for agribusinesses? And the 4th platform will consider the future scenarios and investment opportunities. So stay with us all to the end, 4 weeks of detailed examination of this issue. Before we get started, please allow me to mention some points about organization. Please turn off your video if it's not already turned off and remain muted. A recording will be shared afterwards. And for those that want even more extension activities, please follow the link in your invite or on the Hoover app to the excellent dossier of stimulating documents about the topic. Today's platform will last about an hour. We have 5 speakers and I will select 1 or 2 of your questions to ask them. So please put your questions in the Hoover app under session Q&A. And that is the best way to get a response from participants and to stimulate a discussion. Or you can send your question directly to our Zoom question master by double-clicking on the Zoom question marker name for the day by looking in the participant list. Hoover will remain active, so when we meet again next week on Tuesday for the wrap-up panel, some more participant questions will be discussed. We have 4 experienced speakers on the panel today, who I will introduce before they speak. But first, let me introduce our keynote speaker. Judith Batchelor is the director of Sainsbury's brand. She is responsible for all aspects of Sainsbury's product offer, from policy through to the finished product offer, the one that sits on the shelf. In addition to corporate responsibility, sustainability, and public affairs. She is a biochemist and a registered scientist. In addition to her work at Sainsbury's, Judith is a non-executive director of both the Environment Agency and the Rugby Players Association. Is deputy chair of the Farm Africa Board, a trustee of the Matt Hampson Foundation, and also sits on the UK government's Food and Drink Sector Council. Judith, you're most welcome. Please begin.
Okay, good morning everybody, and thank you first of all to CASA for inviting me to speak at this event, but also apologies for those of you who may be expecting my CEO Mike Coote to come along this morning. It's our interim results today, and I think fundamentally he is more popular this morning than he thought he was going to be in terms of the virus. So I am his deputy, but I suppose the unique vision that I can share with you in the way that our business manages our smallholder producers is that I am a practitioner. So the team that I work with at Sainsbury's, about 250 of them, are the people that will be working with all members of our value chains to bring those products to our counters, and that includes 50% of what we sell, which comes from overseas, and particularly those value chains that are dominated by smallholder producers. And by that, I mean things like tea, coffee, cocoa, palm oil, for example. I think the one thing that is, from our point of view, interesting is that depending on where those smallholders sit in our value chain, and I mean that from a geographic point of view of where they sit, but also where they are upstream from our business, will depend on how well we can see what's happening and how well we can spot some of those vulnerabilities. And I say that because it's very clear that the smallholder producers, and whether that's a smallholder producer that's a dairy farmer in North Wales, or that is a smallholder producer in Rwanda who's producing our red label tea, they are all disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus. And not only disproportionately impacted because of where they sit, either geographically or in the value chain, but disproportionately impacted because they don't have access to some of the information and the insights around what's happening in the marketplace. So as we will know, what has happened in the marketplace is unprecedented in terms of how customers are shopping, what they're buying, the channels by which those products are reaching them, and phenomenal changes over a very short period of time. But for many of those smallholders, they will have no visibility whatsoever of that. So one of the challenges for us is how do we increase that visibility up and down the chain? And I'll come to that at the end with some thoughts on what happens after all this, I say, is over and we come out of the other side. But if you think about the nature of those vulnerabilities, there are a number of things that that fall into vulnerable because economically they are at the mercy of global markets and commodity prices, which for a lot of them they are. Some of them are protected from that through some of the schemes that we put in place around minimum pricing or cost of production and profit models. But some of them who aren't known to us will not be protected economically from some of those things. And how do we get visibility of that? The second area is the area of vulnerability around some of the things that we are well aware of. So things like forced labour, child labour, and overall human rights practices that are tough at the best of times, but when a system is put under pressure, those are the things that tend to go first. And then there's vulnerabilities around product quality, safety, and the way a product is handled. And again, due to stresses on the system, how can we get visibility of those things? And there is a whole big list of risks and vulnerabilities that we will be looking at. So how do we deal with all of that? And as I said, those vulnerabilities will be disproportionate depending on where they sit in the value chain and therefore our visibility of them and where they sit geographically. And the big thing for us is the role that technology can play in that, in helping connect us to those smallholders and those communities. And indeed, some of the work that we do in terms of managing long-term contracts. So if I start with things that we are currently doing, a lot of those communities have got long-term contracts with us, and that, when I say long-term, I'm talking about 3-year contracts where historically many of those things are just sold on the commodity market, so there are no contracts and no commitments. Where those exist, they are very well known to us, and where they've got challenges, we can help them. Sometimes that challenge is not visible to us, and I say that's the problem. But where it is, things like the early payment of invoices, so we're signed up to the prompt payment code, but we will pay immediately small suppliers, and ensuring that when we are paying promptly, either because suppliers have asked us or because they are inherently a small supplier, that money is flowing through the system. And I would say that point where the money from small suppliers throws through the system, again, it is not always visible. So what role of technology? And we've looked at things like blockchain in the past. If fundamentally all of the challenges that we have are challenges of visibility, then what could we do in the future? And we've already been looking at some of these things around these tools around forced labour. So this is things like workplace options, where mobile phone apps can be used for smallholder producers to talk about concerns or worries, or where we can send surveys out and get the feedback from those groups. But those options aren't widely distributed yet, and certainly not directly from our business. We rely on a third party to do that on our behalf, and quite often that's where funding exists or doesn't exist, dictates where those technologies are used. So coming out of all of this at the other end, I think some of the tactical things that we are doing, like the payment codes, like the use of technology, will become some of the structural solutions to some really long-term challenges. And as I say, the biggest of those long-term challenges being the visibility and the transparency of what's going on in those value chains. Who should be responsible for that, whether that's something that is done at a government level and is part of public's general interest, or whether that's something for businesses to do and for businesses to invest in, is always a question that comes out of this. But fundamentally, having technology and using digital technologies in particular to make the global food system more transparent is probably, you know, the big idea that comes out of this. And as I say, I don't necessarily mean blockchain, because as I say, we've tried that before. But when the world can connect in the way that it has over the coronavirus, when we've seen data sharing and the relaxation of competition law in a way that we've never seen it before, when we've seen collaboration between private sector and government in a way that we've never seen it before, there are some real ways of working where the system has delivered unbelievable things in a very short period of time. And our view is that we need to capture those now to help answer some of the underlying structural issues that have been there for a very long time and have never been bottomed out and resolved. So I think one of the things that can come out of all of this is, what does that long-term structural plan look like, so that it doesn't matter who you are within the global food system or where you sit geographically or within the chain itself, is that you are visible to the other stakeholders in that value chain, and those value chains can work for the collective good. So that's my thought to leave you with. Thank you for listening, and again, thank you once again for inviting me. It's great to be here as part of this event. Thank you.
Many thanks, Judith. Thank you very much. Welcomed. In a way, what you said is that the COVID pandemic is revealing the cracks and gaps and obstacles that are in the market system already, but we haven't really been paying full attention to them. Now they've been brought out a little bit more in more full detail. Thank you. Could you perhaps give some examples of where Sainsbury's has discovered unexpected vulnerabilities amongst smallholder farmers, where you thought, wow, I didn't know that was there? And as you said, you can't know all of what's available, but could you give some examples of that, please?
Yeah, I think the big one that springs to mind from my perspective is payment, and the way that those cash flows get to the person who is ultimately at the top of the value chain. And we make some big assumptions that when we pay people promptly, that they pay in turn their suppliers promptly. And particularly where those value chains are visible to us. So if I take something like bananas, where the banana's grown and a banana's sold, and there's not a lot that happens to it in between other than it's on a sea freight container, that becomes very obvious quite quickly. And the connectivity between us and the smallholder growers is a good one. Where those smallholder growers are 2, 3, 4, 5 times removed, and tea is a good one, where historically that would be traded, it would go through a trading desk, it would be mixed and blended, and by the time it got to a tea bag manufacturer in Doncaster, it would be very difficult to trace that tea. Where we have examples like that, it is very difficult for us to know, which is why we've moved to what I talked about before, which is creating dedicated grower groups. So all of our red label tea now comes from 3 areas of producers in Rwanda, Malawi and Kenya. They have a 3-year contract. We know exactly who they are, and we know exactly what they're being paid, and we have some improvement plans in place. clearly we cannot do that for every value chain. And the question is, what is the automated technical answer of doing that enables you to get that much greater visibility? So we're doing some good things, but if I had to describe it, it would be that best practice isn't yet common practice, and we need technology to help us with that.
Thank you very much. Very interesting, and we could talk for so long. Thank you. Now we turn to our next speaker. Dr. Shenghen Fan is currently the chair professor at China Agricultural University, working on global and Chinese food economics and policy. He was until very recently the Director General of the International Food Policy Research Institute. So he has a wide reach and experience across the world. He has more than 30 years of research and leadership experience in international agricultural development, poverty reduction, and food security and nutrition. Welcome, Dr. Fan. Please begin.
Well, first, let me thank you, CASA, and everybody who joined this online discussion for doing this. We are facing a tremendous crisis we have never seen, probably in my own career. I have worked for 35 years on food and nutrition security. So I experienced the financial crisis, 2008 food price crisis, but this one is huge. This one is big. So thank you for doing this. Now, from my perspective, well, I came back to China around the outbreak of the COVID-19. So immediately I jumped into this to work with Chinese colleagues to advise the government what actions we should take to monitor, to check the market price situation in different parts of the country. In the meantime, I'm also working with our international colleagues from Africa, from South Asia, to share the experience, to share the lessons, and to find some common grounds where we can work together. So I wanted to focus on the whole, let's say, the supply chain. You know, the whole chain involves so many actors, particularly the people who are very vulnerable. I think the small producers, small traders, and also the SMEs and so on. So from the production side, obviously smallholders are very vulnerable because of lockdown, because of the restrictions of transportation. So they couldn't get seeds, they couldn't get inputs, they couldn't sell their products. So in the very beginning, particularly fruits, vegetable, and livestock producers, they suffered quite a bit, whether they were in China, whether they were in Africa or South Asia. Then the transportation, because of lockdown, the transportation was very much limited. And again, the lots of traders were very much affected. All the workers in the transportation sector didn't function at all. Then the processors, because lack of labor, lots of people couldn't come to work, they couldn't move around, and the lack of labor has been a serious problem for some of the livestock processors. So in some countries, probably the livestock sector lost 30%, 40%, even 50% of the total output or total production. Vegetables, the same. And then you move to even the consumers, because of a lack of confidence on their jobs, their income, so they reduce their consumption, particularly fruits and vegetables. That affects their nutrition and health for long term, particularly children, women, and their productive age. Now moving to trade, the whole value chain, the trade. Yes, many countries begin to use export bans to secure their own domestic supply, and that has been very bad. But the good news is the G20 and all international organizations have called the countries not to use export bans, which is very good. So the whole value chain has been affected. And I think smallholder producers, smallholder traders, SMEs are all very vulnerable. Now, so what countries have done? Here in China, right after the, let's say the outbreak in Wuhan, the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development issued a very urgent notice, sometimes around the end of January, to make sure that there will be a green channel, so-called green channel or green sort of lane, to make sure that food can be transported without any sort of restrictions. So that really helped. And then in terms of SMEs, the government issued several sort of advice or several sort of policies. One is tax concession, so they don't need to pay tax. They don't need to pay tax for some time. And second is financial support. So part of the stimulus package will be used to help is smallholder producers, smallholder processors, transporters, retailers, and so on. So very quickly, the situation has turned around. So right now here, I'm sitting here in Beijing, in China. I have not seen much sort of impact at all. So okay, so where's the investment, innovations? I think Judith has mentioned about digitalization. I very much agree. So the internet-based platform really helped to shorten the supply chain. So now the smallholder producers and urban consumers can be connected directly. For example, here I'm sitting here in China Agricultural University. I live on campus. Campus has lots of professors, faculty members here. So what they do is, so they use WeChat, to form a friend group to order food from, let's say, from let's say the certain production community. So there's a new contract, to make sure that the food will be delivered from, let's say, a village who produces food to the urban centers here in Beijing. So that really helped to solve the problem, to shorten the supply chain, to cut lots of intermediaries. And I thought that's quite a big innovation, not just a technological innovation, but also institutional innovation. So they begin to find out the contract farming actually works, but in a new meaning, new sense. Now, I think we also need to think of the future food system. What sort of food system we would like to have? So I think consumers are really changing their thinking or their behavior through this. One is probably they wanted to consume safe, green, sustainable, healthy foods. So they probably wanted to cut down meat consumption. But in the meantime, to ensure their adequate nutrition for their health. So one technology is called alternative proteins. So the either the plant-based or using sort of a cultural farming approach to produce meat without much greenhouse gas emission, without using much water, land, and so on. And I think that this could be a really game changer in the future. So the consumers are aware of the impact on the environment, aware of the impact on the health, in the meantime, keep some distance from the nature, like the wild animals and beyond. So I want to stop over here. Julian, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Shengen. Very, very interesting. Could you perhaps give some illustrations of what the green channel looks like? Is food labeled in a certain way? Is there a sign on the side of the truck or the train? How do the controllers know that this product is allowed through, or is it certain roads to certain products?
Yeah, well, one is the trucks. Yes, the trucks are certified, approved by the local government, so they can go through different checkpoints. And they also have this WeChat software, so they can easily see, hey, where that person has been. So I have done that too. So through the cell phone, they will be able to check where have you been. So make sure that you have been in some sort of lower risk areas. And obviously the farming community usually have very, very low risk. So that's quite important. So the green, not really the green food, it's a green channel. So that they can go through different checkpoints without much as a harassment.
All right, thank you. And then could you give us, please, some examples of the problems and implications of labor movement? You talked about that at the beginning. Some examples of the difficulty of labor.
Yeah, well, in the very beginning, the local government, local authorities are struggling between let's say, controlling the diseases and economic activities. It's rather difficult. But in the very beginning, the central government gave very high priority on containing the virus. That was top priority, and at the cost of economic activities. But very quickly, they realized that these two have to be balanced. So they changed the priority. At least later on, the economic activities must be as important as containing the virus. I think that really helped. Then in terms of migrant laborers, yes, absolutely. In the very beginning, they were locked down in their villages, in their homes, without any sort of permission to go out. But later on, it has been gradually, let's say, relaxed, as long as they have stayed somewhere for 2 weeks or 3 weeks. self-quarantined for 2 or 3 weeks, as long as they don't show any symptoms, so they can go back to work. Actually, the government, local government, encouraged them to work, to send the shuttle buses to take the laborers from, let's say, from their hometowns to certain factories, including agriculture, food processing factories. So that really worked, and that happened very quickly. So the food production, food supply chain has been restored here in China very quickly. So far we have not seen any sort of large scale the food shortages or any large scale or even hunger and malnutrition, not at all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fan. Thank you. And now we go to our next speaker. Dr. Bettina Prato is Senior Coordinator of the Smallholder and Agri-SME Finance and Investment Network based at the International Fund for Agricultural Development in Rome. She has 20 years of experience in international development with particular focus on global development governance, development finance, food security, and rural development. She holds a PhD in political science from the University of California at Berkeley. Bettina, you're most welcome. Please begin.
Thank you, Julian. And I hope you can hear me well since I'm calling in from my cell phone. I had some issues connecting, so I wasn't able to actually listen to the first speaker, but I was able to hear Dr. Schengen, so that was a real pleasure. So yes, I've been asked to say a few words about specifically the impact of COVID-19 and the measures taken to address it on small and medium enterprises, which are the main focus of the network that I lead, and particularly when it comes to access to finance. So just a couple of general thoughts to frame what I'd like to share that also echoes in part what Dr. Schengen just laid out. First of all, the dimension of the problem. Really, agri-SMEs are the backbones of food systems across developing countries. So overall, we're talking about a population of enterprises that is hugely important also in terms of livelihoods, jobs, economic contribution. And for many of these, when we're trying to understand what is the impact of the current crisis, the crisis is actually coming within a series of existing crises. Let's think about the locust swarms in East Africa, for example, and the really disruptive impact they've had on agricultural supply chains, among other things. In other contexts, the problems pre-existing include low commodity prices, for example, in relation to coffee, as an example, or conflict situations. So when we're looking at current impact, it's really difficult to isolate this particular factor from others. What we've also seen, and I think it's important to share in terms of framing, is that context really matters, and also the type of value chains that small and medium enterprises are engaged in makes a huge difference. Value chains are being affected differently depending on whether they are more or less labor intensive, whether we're dealing with more perishable food, whether production and processing is directed towards export markets versus domestic markets. So it's a very diverse picture. And then the last point, again, it's important to look at impact across the supply chain, because the ways in which different actors in the supply chain are being impacted has ripple effects. And here, looking at SMEs, the role of agro dealers and processors is really particularly important to look at, to understand the overall ripple effect scenario. Now, we've recently listened to some of our partners in terms of what it is that they're observing on the ground. And to summarize, there's essentially four pathways of impact on agri-SMEs. First is the impact that both the health crisis and the measures taken are having on labor, sort of the cost of ensuring that workers are able to come in and, in observing measures that can preserve their health. This is something that, of course, increases the cost of businesses on the small side in terms of making sure that all the measures are in place. even though agri-food sector workers are considered essential in many countries, the impact of labor, particularly again for smaller units, is really quite significant to measure, to manage. Then, of course, as was just said, significant impact on access to inputs and to markets. Market outlets in many areas are really hard to reach or closed, even where sort of international trade is moving better than in the early days of the crisis. We're still seeing situations where trucks are not circulating due to safety concerns. Agro dealers, small sort of village or community level agro dealers are struggling to keep their businesses open. Fertilizer distribution is facing logistical challenges from cities to rural areas because of curfews, etc. So this is really impacting the capacity of the direct business of many enterprises, but also their capacity to operate when they depend on supply from others. Then impact on access to finance, very much visible, even though many governments are taking measures to strengthen the capacity of financial institutions to engage across the value chain. It's still hard to access physical branches. There's impact on credit history. Financial institutions are struggling to take appropriate measures to measure and price risk right now, and of course face liquidity constraints. So that's one major area of impact. And then the impact on demand, as Dr. Schengen was mentioning. Consumers' habits are changing, but also the economic crisis in some export markets, the closure of restaurants, the closing down of the hospitality industry is having an impact on demand that has that affects agri-SMEs. Now, we are seeing also in terms of impact the emergence of some new realities, particularly within marketing and value chain organization. Very much seeing market diversification emerging as an important strategy for many SMEs, looking for more proximate markets, more direct farmer to consumer selling, but also reorienting, for example, from producing for restaurants to producing for supermarkets, and much more use of e-commerce and development of e-marketplaces. Big emphasis on digital, and also many SMEs considering how to change their business models to integrate digital solutions into their offerings, as well as, of course, with finance. What we're seeing is also the emergence of some platforms that are trying to aggregate a bundle of services for SMEs that include access to markets with access to technical assistance and finance. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that maybe becoming the rule actually going forward. Also, a new, sometimes ad hoc arrangements among value chain players. I believe the speaker from Sainsbury's that I just caught a very little slice of got a very small slice of her presentation. But what we're seeing is also this, sort of large value chain players sort of discussing ways to find solutions on pain points. To maintain payments, for example, when shipments are late or cannot be completed, just to secure their supply, but also to try and bring more transparency into their supply, as was being described, is also something that we are seeing. When it comes to access to finance, specifically, the needs predictably are very much around cash flow. Many small and medium enterprises are experiencing cash flow shortages because they cannot sell their products, which means that they cannot pay their workers or suppliers and stay afloat. So access to working capital is critical, and it's very important that it takes place at the right time. In East Africa, for example, the planting season, much of the planting season was in March. So problems around access to financing, to inputs at that time, if not solved now, can hardly be solved later without major problems down the line. Similarly, East and Central Africa, planting season, May, June, the timeliness of access to capital and inputs is really key. But also we're seeing challenges around asset finance and trade finance because now many small and medium enterprises have to invest more in processing capacity, storage, the cold chain, to make sure that they actually are able to stem losses that can derive from disruptions in logistics. So this is really a key area of financial needs at the moment. Financial service providers are responding in different ways, particularly on the liquidity side. And in turn, many governments are trying to make sure that financial institutions are more liquid or are able to take on more risk. But there are limits to what can be done under current measures. Certainly, this is going to be a problem that will require longer-term visions and solutions. Several impact investors also operating in agriculture, for example, that are investing in MFIs, microfinance institutions, or SMEs, are also coming up with solutions to try and address the different needs, the need for longer grace periods, etc., renegotiating terms, but the long-term sustainability of these measures is really a problem. And then finally, and I will close, there's certainly a reorientation towards digital channels for payments and access to finance that we're seeing across the board, more signatories to digital wallets, but more volumes on transactions. Also some providers that are authorizing higher volumes of transactions, for example, Safaricom in Kenya, or lower cost of transactions to encourage their SMEs and clients in general to use digital channels. And the last example, before I close, is also some examples of collaboration through digital between banks and e-platforms like Alibaba for example, in Hong Kong. HSBC, Hong Kong's largest bank, is collaborating with Alibaba to provide trade financing to local businesses using the platform to essentially scan loan applications built on customer background, sort of what has been transacted on the platform to accelerate access to trade finance. And again, I think we're going to see more of that as we go forward, and certainly some lasting transformations of in business models and value chain arrangements. So that's it on my side.
Thank you very much, Bettina. You've said a lot, a great deal, and that's been very, very helpful. Thank you. In fact, that's partly how I wanted to respond. You've really given us a real indication of how many problems people are facing, how systemic those problems are, the interconnectedness and complexity of those problems. And clearly, you work for a very large organization which has a network across the world, so you're able to draw on that. Other than the dossier which is attached to this platform, which gives information about what the impact, could you recommend any other sources of information that you've been using that others might be able to tap into so they can learn more about the implications and the impact on the system?
Yeah, this is really a moving target, Julian, because sort of new data is new analysis is emerging every day. So what I could suggest, and I'd be happy to share also with you and participants is a link to some of the information that we're collecting through our members that are conducting surveys. Financial institutions, networks of financial institutions operating in agriculture are conducting surveys in real time, essentially, and many of the farmers organizations that we work with are doing the same. So I think that right now the information that is really important to look into is, in my view, is really the field information, because the situation is evolving so rapidly, and I think we really need to build a better picture of that as it unfolds.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Very good point. And now we go to our next speaker, Hans Mazura is an experienced market systems development professional with more than 25 years working extensively on market systems programming, including public-private partnerships, adaptive programming, and leveraging private sector investments across several countries in Africa. He holds an MA in Sustainable International Development from Brandeis University and currently works as the country manager for CASA in Uganda. Hans, over to you.
One second, Hans, I think you're on mute. We will unmute you shortly.
Thank you, Julian, and good evening, good morning, all participants. Happy to be part of this panel. I'll be talking, my discussion today will be focused on the impact on the agribusiness sector, particularly in Uganda, as well as other CASA implementing countries, looking at the responses so far, as well as what CASA is trying to do. Of course, we'll appreciate and understand it's a little bit too early to exactly ascertain the exact impact as well as long-term impact, considering that we've just been in lockdown for just over 1 month. Like others have said, it's a rapidly changing environment. It's really extremely difficult to quantify the exact magnitude of the impact of these measures that the government has put in place. But I'll just, give you what is ongoing, and my discussions really is based on discussions we've been having with our partners, the agribusinesses, the financial institutions, as well as other private sector development programs operating in Uganda. All will depend, looking at the impact, all will depend on how long this lockdown and restrictions of movements will be in place. Also, we need to understand the disruptions have not impacted agribusinesses evenly. Some have been negative, some have been a little, quote unquote, positive. And I will also, aware of the fact that this is just, this platform is part of a month-long series. We'll be having other sessions where that will be followed, on support, sustainability, and the futures. So I'll not go much into detail on what we are coming up as, concrete solutions, but I'll tell you how we're getting there. So first is what is the situation on the ground in Uganda. So government, like many other African countries, have put in place measures to contain the spread of the pandemic. A lot of these really was on the health side. This includes the closure of the country's borders, schools, restriction of public gatherings, suspending refugee centers, instituting guidelines on social distancing, and lockdown on public transport, as well as a curfew, nationwide curfew. In addition to its potential health effects, COVID threatens profoundly affect the livelihoods of poor rural farmers who depend on agriculture. Although these measures have been put in place ideally to address the spread of the pandemic, the disease, it's also affected the livelihoods. And I would say, I'll just give you the current measures include what the government has called standard operating procedures. Among those includes social distancing, where you're not supposed to come close, supposed to have a distance of about 4 meters, and it's key really to controlling the virus spread, but has a ripple effect on industries, especially high contact industries. If you're looking at, for example, extension services, where you get farmers coming together to collectively aggregate and receive extension services, that has been an impact on, it has created an impact on delivery of extension services by the agribusinesses. Closing borders, to date, I think about 50 countries in Africa have closed their borders, including Uganda, as well as the use of airports and water ports. That has impacted, of course, inflow and outflow of goods. The curfew and lockdowns that I talked about to limit citizens have restricted movement, and that, of course, really has brought a huge disruption in the supply chains of the agribusiness sectors, the agribusiness sector in Uganda. Working remotely, most offices have closed and are encouraging workers to work from home. It's a brutal choice between lives and livelihoods, but we have to do that. Much as this has affected the agribusinesses, we understand if we don't address the health issue first, we'll not be able to continue with agriculture. But then how has this global health pandemic that is resulting into an economic issue affected the agribusinesses in Uganda? Most of the agribusinesses that we're talking to, because of the impact on the physical supply chains, has also meant that the cash cycles are being affected. As cash cycles extend, it might bring financial stress into some of the companies. As businesses struggle with to manage cash flows and stay afloat, the automatic reflex is usually to lay off workers. And we've seen that happening in some agribusinesses where they're laying off for workers. But again, they have to be careful of the legal implications that they may get into. So they are trying to restructure the contracts, working with workers' associations to see how to manage the situation. We've seen, in some, again, like I said, not all value chains have been impacted evenly. In some areas, prices have dropped drastically. In some areas, prices are the same. In some areas, there's been a little bit of an increase in the prices. I'll not say there's as such a food shortage in Uganda. I know there's some pockets, especially in the urban areas, that have had issues, especially for those who live for hand to mouth. But really, nationwide, we still have food. We had a great harvest. But again, like as I say, it depends on how long this lockdown will be in place. A number of agricultural industry's performance is interlinked to some sectors. If you looked at tourism and the restaurant sector, there's been a decline in demand for food, for the dining sectors, the restaurant sectors, and this will definitely hurt the agribusinesses. The tax landscape is a bit complex in Uganda. EPO is usually a significant matter as proposed tax amendments are issued, and most people keep their fingers crossed, hoping there are no major changes during this time, and hoping they will not be resulting to higher taxes, resulting to greater administrative burden. Nothing has been announced yet. EPO starts tomorrow. We're hoping come May, as discussions are ongoing. I know a number of bodies are lobbying the government to really address issues of the taxes. Extension.
Okay. Thank you, Hans. Thank you. Could I just ask a question? Do you find that in places where farmers are in associations, are they more or less impacted by COVID-19?
Less impacted.
All right. And then I have another question for you, which is that could you tell us a little bit about the rapid market assessments that CASA is doing in Uganda, Malawi, and Nepal? Just briefly, please. Yeah,
thank you very much. Yeah, so again, what is CASA doing? Based on what is happening, what is saying, and we're saying we need evidence-based decision. CASA is undertaking a rapid market assessment to get the exact information on the ground on how the pandemic is affecting agribusinesses, affecting agri-investors, what opportunities are there. And we've started, across the 3 countries, conducting these assessments that will be able to give us some data and analytics that will get us some more evidence-making decision. A lot of this will be looking at how do we support agribusinesses to survive, recover, respond, and thrive.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So we can hear more about that during the rest of this series of platforms. Thank you very much indeed, Hans, for your contribution. That was much appreciated by everybody, I'm sure. And now we move to our next speaker, our final speaker. Aviva Kutnik is a Foreign Service Officer currently serving as the Division Chief for Markets and Finance in USAID Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. The division supports USAID field missions on programming to facilitate agriculture finance, investment promotion, agriculture technology commercialization, and market systems approaches to agriculture-led growth and food security. Aviva also represents USAID as the steering committee chairperson on Agri-Results, Pay for Results private sector, multi-donor $150 million initiative. She was a Peace Corps volunteer in Uzbekistan and has a master's in economics and international relations from SAIS and an undergrad degree from the University of Maryland. Welcome, Aviva.
Great, thank you. It's wonderful joining everyone today for this important discussion. Thank you for inviting USAID to participate. It was an excellent panel keynote, I think, representing diverse viewpoints and places that we sit and must work together in this really complex environment that's, as noted before, is being challenged more than ever. In terms of the I think as data and information is coming out, it's becoming increasingly clear that COVID-19 impacts, while at first very much focused on health sector, that projections are emerging that food security and poverty may be quite severely impacted in the coming months and years. And so USAID, and I know many others, have recognized our need to, at this moment, continue our efforts on the health front, but as well as ramp up and solidify our food security investments, which very much includes strengthening and building resilience in local food systems. As many know, and as many donor and other organizations have come to over the past few years, that emphasis on private sector engagement as a fundamental tool to achieve development objectives is now more critical than ever. And of course, in the food security realm, that those partnerships with food supply chain SMEs, as well as working with finance providers to de-risk lending to the SMEs, as Bettina touched on before, is quite important to the success of food security programming. With that framing, I'd like to spend just a few moments looking at how USAID is addressing some of the medium and longer term impacts of COVID-19 on hunger and poverty. First, looking at trade and policy actions, echoing some of what Dr. Cheng and Fan had touched on earlier, as well as Hans, the importance of data and working with partner governments on utilizing data and analysis to really inform policy decisions in order to keep trade of food, agricultural products, and inputs flowing. We're also advocating for green channels, designating workers, businesses in the agriculture food sectors as essential, while of course maintaining food safety. And I think it's important, once these initial green channels are established, we need to keep monitoring them and getting feedback from agri-food businesses, apex businesses, as well as SMEs, to ensure that it's not just that logistics and other support services are also able to function as part of those green channels. And we're also supporting avenues for private sector, including SMEs, to be providing input into policy formulation and implementation. Of course, this is something that would be best practice, and that is already starting in a number of country contexts for policy formation around the food and agriculture sectors. But it's honestly not happening enough, and there may be a bit of an opportunity here as more information and exchange is needed. It's also, of course, important to keep local food production at the forefront, and very importantly at this moment, to connect that food production to markets, particularly for animal source food and other fresh and nutritious foods to be available at affordable prices. You know, there's a worry here that as incomes are become lower, as we enter, people have less purchasing power, and so they may opt into, and they may be forced to opt into, less nutritious foods. And we want to make sure that diet quality and that the impacts of nutrition are also key as we're looking at these agriculture and food system challenges and what we can do to support them. And while it appears, I think, as Hans also mentioned, that harvests are looking relatively well, of course there's pockets, there's a locust outbreak, there's other conflict that are challenging production in certain areas. Overall, harvest levels are looking quite quite normal. So it's not the necessary availability of food that's the challenge, but it's the access and affordability. So it's more important than ever that we support SME, supply chain actors, logistics, transport, et cetera, to be able to get those foodstuffs to market. Keeping markets, SMEs, and jobs going. It's always been a driver of USAID and other development partners' approach to food security, agriculture-led growth, fostering competitive, inclusive, and resilient markets, kind of part of the fundamental of market systems approaches. We recognize humanitarian assistance simply won't be sufficient. And so we need to ensure that markets are nimble and have the opportunity and the resources to be able to adapt to the shifting dynamics and preferences that COVID-19 are leading to meet demand for safe and nutritious foods. And we're in dialogue with many of the partners we've been working with over the years, companies, SMEs, finance partners, different networks, on how we can work together to coordinate and collaborate to jointly do this going forward. USAID right now is the Feed the Future initiative, which is the US government's primary food security and global hunger initiative, is a $1 billion initiative. And so right now across the world, all of our missions are really looking at how we can strengthen and also pivot programming to address the challenges that are emerging. And then wanted to touch on for a moment, access to finance for SMEs is now more critical than ever. This is already a challenge, as Bettina has mentioned. So this is, we're glad to see and to support some coalitions coming together to be able to help and figure out how unique blended finance or subsidized finance, concessional finance, facilities or funds can address SME needs. And we also appreciate and understand the need for financial service and business development service providers being part of this, kind of that traditional technical assistance being part of this formula, because companies and SMEs are, on the one hand, challenged to potentially completely pivot business models, and they may need some support and advice to do that successfully. On the other hand, some of the smaller and more informal SMEs may be uniquely situated to be able to pivot. They're very nimble in some cases, and so we're starting to see some SMEs shift their business models and be able to adapt to these market changes. Just some notes on, the importance of SMEs in the sector, I think has been discussed by a few, by the other panelists. So a little bit of what we're hearing on the ground. USAID supports a network of hundreds, if not thousands of programs across the world that support businesses. We've heard from partners in East Africa that work with SMEs in food processing that around 50% of SMEs have stopped producing or have limited their production and working. Firms are making very difficult decisions on their workforce, cutting pay, furloughing workers, shutting facilities. We know that SMEs are affected throughout all sectors of the supply chain and recognize the variability that some of the previous speakers have discussed. Most impacted areas right now seem to be perishables, fresh milk, fruits, vegetables, and that's of course as mentioned, particular concern because of the potential nutrition impacts. And then mentioning that SMEs are taking, as we've heard, workforce health and safety issues in mind. They're struggling, of course, but want to adapt to new health guidelines and may need to be supported to do so. It's difficult to access in some cases, face masks or other hygiene products. And many are, of course, improving their sanitation practices, hand washing, et cetera. Would also mention, a lot of different examples, but I see time is short. I think in all of this, it's important also that we continue to prioritize inclusion. So really thinking about we want to keep supporting businesses, but we want to also keep supporting, keep in mind the unique role that women are playing potentially as food producers, working in processing, and also as caregivers in the family. And we also want to strive for inclusion to help reduce poverty, malnutrition. Our regular and normal development objectives are still key at these moments. And we like to build back better, right, to ensure that the markets and food systems are prepared for future shocks and stresses such as this one. So I think I'll end there. Again, thank you to the other panelists for their insights, and USAID welcomes in our country programs as well as at headquarters in Washington, D.C. Further collaboration.
Excellent, Aviva. Thank you very much indeed. And I really liked the involvement at the end you made, the point about inclusion. I've been waiting, and I'm sure I missed it earlier from other people and even looking at the questions online. Could you say a little bit more, because it matters so much, how women are being disproportionately affected by this crisis as mothers, and also caring for their children, but also as workers, as in many ways that women act in the market. Just a little bit more about that, please.
Yes, thank you so much for the question. We have a whole sector of our office that really has their eye on inclusion. I know that in addition to the multiple stressors, there's also an issue of increasing household violence, interpersonal family violence. That's more stresses on the household is also a factor. I don't have the data or information in front of me, but because this is a series, I can absolutely speak to my colleagues and provide that at one of the follow-up convenings. It's an excellent question.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Aviva, for your great contribution. Thank you for waiting as well while everybody else spoke. And on that last point, I encourage all participants to raise a question about inclusivity and the role that gender plays and all other aspects of exclusion that happens in society. As I said before, I feel that this stress that we're feeling is revealing many cracks in the agricultural food system. Well, that brings us to the end of the platform today. Thank you very much for your participation. On behalf of the participants, thank you very much to all the speakers for their brave efforts to summarize such a complex and still emerging situation. It's very difficult to talk about it when we're only just discovering it. And on behalf of the organizers, well done to the participants for all your excellent contributions. And well done to the tech people in the background who helped all this to happen. Please keep coming with your questions over the weekend and in next week on Tuesday, at the same time for the wrap-up panel when the discussion will continue. Have a safe weekend, and I look forward to seeing you all next week and reading your chats online very, very soon. Thank you.